Darkest Dungeon 2 is one of the most intimidating sequels relative to its predecessor that I've ever seen. Between a flurry of middling reviews, promotional material that's difficult to make sense of, and an overwhelming sentiment of the game being so different from the original that they're hard to even compare, it's led to a huge portion of the first game's player base becoming somewhat estranged from even approaching the follow-up entirely. And honestly, I don't blame them. It's a higher price tag with less goodwill, no guarantee of familiarity, and to top it all off, you have to pay extra for the Crusader. Not exactly the perfect storm for drawing in existing fans, if you ask me. And I'm speaking from experience here because I was one of those people. With hundreds of hours in the original Darkest Dungeon, spent perfecting my parties, maximizing my knowledge of every environment, and fine-tuning the roster of my hamlet, whenever I did see a clip or advertisement for Darkest Dungeon 2, it just didn't look like what I knew. And that's because, for the most part, it isn't. But that doesn't mean it isn't worth experiencing, nor does it mean that there aren't at least some connections we can grasp to make your descent into this brand new adventure a little less tumultuous. So, I encourage you, the experienced but apprehensive slayer of cosmic threats, to embark on this journey with me, as I cover everything you need to know to cut out those initial frustrations and misunderstandings, and get started in Darkest Dungeon 2 with a sword freshly sharpened. The very first thing you'll notice, besides the incredible graphical overhaul, is that we've gone up in the world. Instead of having to walk around and clear corridors little by little on foot, we've got a horse-drawn stagecoach to take us through entire regions instead. But despite appearances, these systems aren't all too dissimilar. You can go forwards automatically, which propels you towards events, instigates positive and negative chatter between your party members, and uses up torchlight. Or you can stop to manage your inventory and inspect your team. The main difference here is that since your pathing is on rails, with your objective always being ahead of you, you can't go backwards or explore the map whatsoever. But as the structure of the game becomes more apparent, rest assured, this will make sense. Now, while this would usually be the point where we visit our hamlet to begin deconstructing the metagame, here there's no such thing, or nothing remotely reminiscent of the original game systems at the very least. This is a bit of a white lie that we'll come back to later, but for all intents and purposes, after selecting your confession/difficulty level, the game just starts, allowing you to pick your characters and embark on an adventure straight away. And let's talk about those characters a little, because compared to their predecessors, I think it's fair to say that there's way more going on. Not only have their kits been altered at a fundamental level to make each one feel like its own class as opposed to an archetype, but with 11 abilities to slot into their repertoire as opposed to the former 7, each one has the potential to fulfill various different roles depending on how they're built, positioned, and pathed, with pathing being selectable variations which further alter the character's stats to help them fit into a certain role. Take the Highwayman as a very basic example. As you know, normally he likes to be near the front, slashing, blasting, and riposting his enemies into deadly submission. But if you decide to run him with the sharp shot path, all of a sudden his ranged options become considerably more enticing, giving him the tools he needs to terrorize the opposition from the back ranks and return to that preferred position when displaced. There's also Rogue, which is melee focused, and Yellow Hand, which is bleed focused, but you get my point. Each class has 3 additional paths to choose from to define them beyond their default, and it makes crafting a team capable of fulfilling specific niches a far more thoughtful process overall. The formula's no longer healer, damage, and your choice of support to plug the holes in your approach. This game is one of buffers, debuffers, and disruptors, with less access to healing being offset by more consistency in how you can both guarantee guarantee big damage for yourself, and evade big damage from your enemies if you fine-tuned your lineup to be ready for the challenge. So, with that said, what are we up against, and how do we fight? Well, at a fundamental level, very similarly to the first game. Positioning dictates ability usage and target validity, and from there it's up to you to combine your offensive and support skills in such a way that victory is assured. But if bashing your head against the opposition and healing off the damage was all it took to understand Darkest Dungeon 2, then this would be a very short section. And it isn't, because combat, for the most part, has been overhauled into a different beast entirely. These are tokens. Buffs, debuffs, and effects which are present in every single battle in the entire game in some way. Yes, there really are that many, but no, you don't need to be intimidated, because honestly, most of them only appear in very specific scenarios. And when you break this list down into the effects which you really need to understand, it ends up looking more like this. For yellow tokens, or buffs, block is a 50% damage reduction upon being attacked, dodge is a 50% chance to avoid the attack altogether, guarded means the unit with the token is being protected by another combatant, riposte allows the defending party to counterattack, strength is a 50% damage increase upon attacking, and crit is a 50% damage or healing increase relative to the ability's highest possible output, along with other contextual benefits depending on the ability that was used. Then for blue tokens or debuffs, blind is a 50% chance to miss your next attack, daze delays your turn until the end of the round, stun occurs when it's applied on its own or daze is stacked and negates a turn altogether, taunt forces the opposition to attack the unit bearing the token if they're able, vulnerable causes you to take 50% more damage from an attack, and weak causes you to deal 50% less damage on your next attack. And there's also death armor, which protects enemies from being vulnerable to death blows until it's broken, or you attack them with very specific abilities. Like I said, there's no need to be worried. This is all very simple stuff. 50% increases, decreases, and turn manipulation, all designed to mitigate the coin flip nature of the first game, where bad luck could do you in far more easily. If a leper in the original Darkest Dungeon with a maxed out chop and additional accuracy trinkets missed an attack which could have saved a party member by complete chance, it was a tough pill to swallow. But in Darkest Dungeon 2, I know that if my leper has a blind token, which as a class he often does, then he has a flat 50% chance to miss. And if he isn't blind, nor does the enemy have a dodge token, then it's going to hit every time. These effects are still difficult to manage, and they will force you to take risks that you aren't sure of, but their prevalence roots the game in a level of consistency that the original never had. Stun looping, heal botting, even if you could, which you can't really in this game, you don't need to do those things as a safety net anymore. The playing field is far more well defined, to both your own and your enemy's advantage. The last token I wanted to mention here is combo. Unique in that it doesn't do anything specific, it's all contextual, usually conferring a small benefit to the unit who attacked the combatant bearing the token, like increased damage, a greater chance of a DOT being applied, or more specific stuff like the Man-at-Arms healing upon attacking such an enemy. Capitalizing on combo is great, but don't forget that if you plan on making use of it a lot, you'll need one or more characters on your team who are proficient at applying it too, like the Jester. Though if you do find a gap in your approach, like a debuff that you can't cleanse or an enemy that's particularly resistant to your team's offense, you aren't entirely out of luck, because the all-new combat items, equipable on each of your 4 combatants from their character sheet, are here to help you turn the tide, with healing, token application or removal, and just generally easing your pain. There's way too many to cover individually of course, but they're all super helpful, just don't forget to equip them. In sharp contrast to the returning item type from the original Darkest Dungeon, trinkets are not all super helpful whatsoever. It's the same fare as the last game. All but the most valuable are based entirely on trade-offs, with the most risky being cultist trinkets, which, aside from forcing you to equip a corresponding item to even activate their power, which takes up both of your character's trinket slots, offer effects that, while strong, come with a detrimental trade-off that makes the context you choose to use them in incredibly important. And if the game's detriments become too much to bear, and your team ends up in a state of crisis despite your best efforts, you'll be pleased to know that Darkest Dungeon's signature stress and death mechanics will still mercilessly beat you into the ground, just like they used to. Kind of. The most immediately noticeable difference is that stress, as a mechanic, has been scaled back, both numerically and functionally, at least as far as individual battles are concerned. Meltdowns, previously known as afflictions, occur when a character reaches 10 stress instead of the former 100, and while it does make them easier to kill by damaging them significantly and reducing their death blow resistance, among other effects that we'll get into later, it's significantly less dangerous here because no matter how stressed your hero becomes, they'll never have a heart attack like they could in the original game, nor will they constantly assail the rest of the party for the remainder of the expedition. There are systems in place to give meltdowns long-term repercussions, but we're not quite there yet, so let's take a quick look at the other side of this coin. Resolute, the replacement for Virtuous, is a similar deal to meltdowns. They'll help you win the battle that's in front of you where its counterpart would make it more difficult, but it's nothing like the original Darkest Dungeon. You don't get a super weapon who carries your team for an entire region, you get a lucky break, and some long-term benefits where there would otherwise be detriments. But if you don't get very lucky and your characters need to tank some death blows before they can get back on your feet, it's important to know your chances. And just like death itself, it's really simple. Every time a dying character takes damage, they lose 10% of their death blow resistance, in addition to receiving 2 weak tokens and a speed debuff for entering that state in the first place. The more they're hit, the more likely they are to die. That's all there is to it. Alright, you know how to fight, I think, and hopefully not die, for the time being at least, so let's turn our attention towards traversing this land to make sure that when you do engage in a fight, it's on your own terms. A journey in Darkest Dungeon 2 is split up into multiple regions, large maps which are then further divided into nodes, with each one representing an event that you can engage with should you choose to move towards it when there's a fork in the road. The direction that you decide to move in can be influenced by plenty of things, like the preference of your team or a necessity of resources that taking a detour will provide. And I'll go over them now as concisely as I can to make sure you know exactly what you're getting into. Resistance Encounters, Creature Dens, Oblivion's Ingress, Chirurgeon's Table, Oblivion's Rampart, and Layers are all nodes where you're able to do battle with your enemies and obtain rewards for doing so, like relics and baubles, which are the 2 main currencies of the game, trinkets, and fire fuel flame. Layers in particular are incredibly dangerous, giving you the opportunity to fight through 2 waves of enemies before you try and fell one of the game's regional bosses, which offer a brutally difficult battle in exchange for some of the most powerful trinkets in the game. The Academic Study, Oasis, Desperate Few, and Watchtower are all nodes where you discover something, with all but the Watchtower, which fills out your map, giving you the opportunity to choose your reward, or lack thereof, based on the thoughts of your party members. This is also how most of the battle nodes work too. You don't always have to engage in resistance encounters or delve into a creature den. If even one of your characters is against it, you're completely free to leave, usually at the cost of some flame. Though the lack of a universal "I'm avoiding that" option, like the original game had, does place additional emphasis on the character quirks which dictate how they'll engage with certain encounters. The path you've chosen for the Stagecoach, no matter how considered, can still confer negative outcomes if you're your team isn't up to dealing with what you throw at them. The Hoarder and Field Hospital are the shops of Darkest Dungeon 2, particularly useful for stocking up on combat items and removing negative quirks respectively. But their services do go beyond that. There's often rare trinkets available, and of course healing services, which are kind of useful sometimes, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Oh, and there's also the Academic's Cache, which is literally just free stuff, no strings. The most unique node you can encounter in each region, which is very much detached from the rest of the game, is called the Shrine of Reflection. These encounters are designed to expand on the game's story, with narration and battles which all relate to a specific character's backstory, the subject of which you're free to choose upon entering the node, with a brand new ability being granted to them every time you complete one of their 5 chapters as a reward, with a bonus at the end extending their base repertoire of 5 skills to a fully fitted 11. There's also a few subnodes which we'll cover real quick. These are spaces you drive through instead of stopping at. Red battles are self-explanatory. The only difference between these and resistance encounters is that your characters won't consider their options before you begin. Orange wheels denote a rough patch of terrain, which reduces your wheel count by 1, leading to a crash if you try to traverse another with no wheels left. And purple shields are exactly the same thing, with the resource they deplete, armor, being the only difference. If you do end up crashing, you'll be subject to a particularly challenging encounter where your party will always be down a character as one is selected each round at random to lose their turn and repair the stagecoach. Honestly, the best way to avoid this is to try and find a watchtower as early in the region as possible. That way you can plan a route that your vehicle is robust enough to weather. The last subnode is the blue Oblivion's Tear, and this one can also be attached to other bigger nodes too. Travelling through an Oblivion's Tear or arriving at a node associated with one will always afflict you with 1 tier of loathing, an effect which basically makes it easier for enemies to gain advantages over you when you enter combat by both increasing their chances at a flat rate and hastening the drain of your flame, which also has that effect at low light levels. Encounters with a few modifiers involved might not sound so bad to begin with, but it's the stacking effect that makes it problematic, because while Loathing Tier 1, 2, and 3 are all direct increases to both flame reduction and the chance of an enemy advantage, Tier 4, completely out of pocket, increases the maximum HP of the final boss, which is something that, as you will come to understand the more you play this game, you really don't want to happen. Avoiding these things altogether is my primary advice, but if you need to get it under control, completing any full-size battle node will help reduce it. So, hopefully I've saved you some time there, wondering why your stagecoach crashed when you were steering it flawlessly, or what that weird blue fire is that seems to make everyone sad. And to round this section out, I think it only makes sense to briefly touch on how moving around the map affects the state of your characters, because nothing you do in these games, even if it's just moving forwards, is without risk. If you've played the original Darkest Dungeon, the way this works will be exceptionally familiar to you. Party members chatter to each other about random stuff, and they'll either project encouragement, which reduces stress, or disparagement, which increases stress, with a low flame level and pre-existing mental ailment, increasing the chances of the latter to lead to an almost inevitable snowballing effect, which calls for constant and effective management of each character's cognitive condition, ensuring that they don't call each other stupid so much that their ability to fight is crippled before a battle has even begun. The other most prominent quirk of travel in Darkest Dungeon 2 is the way healing works. I mentioned a ways back that heal botting isn't really a thing in this game. Most of the best restorative abilities are either conditional, like the Plague Doctor's Battlefield Medicine requiring that the target be at less than 50% HP, or require significant setup, like the Vestal's Divine Grace requiring 3 turns worth of charge before it can be unleashed at full power. So, you might be wondering how, with healing being much more difficult to access, we keep our characters alive. And the answer is actually very simple. They just regenerate between nodes. This definitely makes each fight feel much more standalone as opposed to being a piece of a larger region, but with individual battles requiring far more strategy to overcome relative to the original Darkest Dungeons fodder, allowing you to begin each encounter on somewhat even ground does make sense. Now, let's assume that, despite some drama, difficulties, and a companion of yours perishing in the process, you finally made it to Darkest Dungeon 2's equivalent of a campfire, one of the game's many inns. Functioning as a shop, upgrade station, and opportunity to apply buffs and stress relief alike, there's a huge amount you can do here to improve your chances of success. And since we're missing a body, let's take a second here to fix that. You can pick any character you want that you haven't already used to join your party completely free of charge. Full health, any abilities that you want, it's a clean swap, and an invaluable boon for getting back on your feet after a brutal region. But the rest of the team still isn't looking so hot, so let's move over to the Provisioner, who sells combat items, trinkets, Stagecoach items, and most notably here, inn items, to help them relax and manage their ailments. As I mentioned, most of this stuff is for direct stress relief, but you can also increase their resistances and bestow very small buffs to make the next region you tackle just a little easier. I just mentioned Stagecoach items, which are pretty important too, so let's head over to the Wainwright to get a grasp on how they work. These items can confer a huge range of benefits to your journey. There's one for pretty much anything you need, whether it's generating consumables of any kind for you to use, improving your scouting abilities, inventory, or armor. They really are indispensable. And if you manage to find or buy one, equipping it at the Wainwright, given that you can't do it anywhere else, can make your adventure far more manageable. There's also trophies, which are super powerful trinket-like hybrids obtainable from regional bosses, and pets, which are basically free Stagecoach items that you unlock during progression to equip from this screen, along with the repair service, which trades your purple currency, baubles, for individual charges of wheels and armor to keep your coach alive. The inn can also help you add some flair to your team's existing repertoire in the form of mastery, a system which lets you exchange blue mastery tokens obtainable from each region to give any ability of any character a one-time boost that persists throughout the entire run, which is a pretty stark contrast to the original game's 5-tier upgrade tree, but it makes sense. When you're playing a game where much of your progress is reset upon failure, you want those enhancements that you do get to have a big impact immediately, and for the most part, they do, with some of the most notable modifying or increasing the number of tokens that an ability can produce, in addition to scaling up the damage of your tried and tested favorites. And when you're finally ready, having mulled over each service that the inn can offer to put you in the best standing possible for the upcoming challenge, it's time to choose which region you actually want to travel to. Quirks, combat items, and most prominently modifiers can have a big impact on how each stretch of your campaign will pan out, so it's worth considering your options before you lock it in to make sure you're traveling to a region that both your team and inventory is best suited to. Oh, and there's one more facet of the inn that I ought to mention. Remember the bounty hunter? The point man of your mark teams who would deal huge damage and punch your enemies in the head with his bare hands? Well, he's still in the game, just not as a character present in the standard roster. Instead, his contract will randomly appear at an inn, giving you the opportunity to temporarily replace a party member on your team with him for a single region, and leverage the huge amount of raw power that he holds. Directly comparing the characters of Darkest Dungeon 2 to their original counterparts, you can kind of see how much of their strength was rerouted to make them less cheap and more strategically involved. But the bounty hunter, being an occasional boon that you'll rarely have on your team, sidesteps this idea entirely, working with combo now instead of mark to deal devastating amounts of damage and stun the opposition with ease. Okay, now I'm gonna be honest with you. There's a couple of things I've been avoiding and or sidestepping throughout this video. The first is the metagame, which is its whole own thing, which we'll be covering shortly, and the second is what I'm about to talk about, and I think when I explain it, you'll understand why. Characters. Darkest Dungeon is built on them. They have their own quirks, needs and wants, they get sick, they get stressed, and end up, with some careful planning on your end, becoming a ruthless specialist with excellent buffs and manageable debuffs. Working on building up a roster like this, full of powerful dungeon crawlers, was a huge draw of the original game, but in the sequel, it's been scaled back significantly. You get one character of each class who persists and becomes eligible for buffs if they survive a run, but that's all there is to it. There's very little actual management. No, in its place is an entirely new system which is designed to work on a run-by-run basis: relationships. Relationships are everywhere in Darkest Dungeon 2, and their potential impact on the outcome of your expedition cannot be overstated enough. Almost everything you do affects what your party members think of each other. The choices you make when you encounter an event, the recipient of aid when multiple are in need, especially meltdowns and resolute procs, and even simple chatter can raise and lower these constantly fluctuating bonds between each character, which, if not managed properly with careful decision making and in-items, can result in detrimental fractures between your team called negative relationships, leading to debuffs, increased stress, literal backstabs, and the most challenging ailment, at least potentially, cursed skills, which force the characters engaged in the negative relationship to have a randomly cursed ability selected at all times, which, when used, transfers a debuff of some kind to their partner. It sounds a lot like what afflictions used to be, right? So it only makes sense that some sort of virtue is also possible here, and you'd be right because it comes in the form of positive relationships. It's basically the same thing but reversed. Lower stress, extra attacks, which target the enemy, not the teammate, and instead of cursed skills, blessed skills, which come without the restriction of them being forcefully selected, and offer buffs to the character's partner where there would otherwise be detriments. If you were wondering why meltdowns and resolutes don't feel as impactful as their predecessors, it's because relationships have lifted a lot of their functionality to become a long-term reward system which fits each run's more elaborate structure. Though it should be noted that even though relationships are designed to be built up throughout the course of a game, when a bond or rift is eventually formed, which is not guaranteed by the way, it only lasts for a single region, with each one being recalculated at the very end of each visit to an inn, making that brief management period where relationship boosting items are available absolutely imperative to avoiding a negative outcome. And with that, at least as far as a journey into the main game of Darkest Dungeon 2 is concerned, I've told you pretty much everything you need to know. The gameplay loop goes something like this. You choose your characters, taking quirks, abilities, and pathing into consideration, complete a region, carefully deciding which route to take to balance danger with reward, manage your team's stress levels and relationship status at the inn, along with buying items, stabilizing your stagecoach, and assigning mastery tokens, and repeat until you reach the final boss. If you die, it's back to the beginning. If you win, you unlock the next difficulty level. A very apt comparison that I've seen, and I'm not going to claim this is an original thought because I've seen it a lot, is that this game is kinda like Darkest Dungeon Slay the Spire, structurally at least. You move forwards through a map with multiple forks in the road to decide how much risk you want to take, ration out your resources to make sure you can make it to the end of the act or region, barely alive but just enough to heal at the inn, and face elites, or bosses, on your own terms. If you have no idea what I was just talking about, then First of all, play Darkest Dungeon 2, but play Slay the Spire as well. It's one of the best games ever, it needs no introduction, and it was clearly a big inspiration here. Now, before we wrap up and I give you a little conclusion on the game and get down to asking whether it's really for you, I'm gonna get a little irritable, because the last topic for us to cover here is one that I just really don't understand. So, after you finish a run, regardless of whether you died or succeeded, you're awarded candles, a currency that can be used in the quote-unquote metagame of Darkest Dungeon 2, the Altar of Hope, to unlock brand new stuff which will show up in later runs, similar to any other roguelite game that you've ever played. It's how you unlock almost everything, actually. Characters, except that one, combat, stagecoach, and inn items, trinkets, pets, direct upgrades / buffs, new paths. You basically just dump your candles into whatever you want, and it makes it better or gives you something new. That's fine. That's okay. A little uninspired, but whatever. What I really can't get my head around is why the Shrine of Reflection, and by extension the abilities for each of your characters, wasn't integrated into the system at all. I'm not gonna lie to you, it's tedious unlocking each individual ability at a snail's pace when all you really want to do is get a gauge of your party's full repertoire so you can put some cool teams together that synergize properly. In the original game, if you wanted a support crusader and had some gold lying around, all you had to do was buy into the abilities that you wanted him to use, with Holy Lance, of course, being a staple of that build. And when I unlocked the character in Darkest Dungeon 2, this was my first thought. The Crusader has always been a better support than a frontliner, so I went to gear him up, only to realise that I didn't have the skills I wanted to make it work, nor could I just buy them with candles. Like everything else. I had to dedicate 4 Shrines of Reflection to the Crusader just to get access to what is, arguably, his most iconic ability. I'm not saying that the Shrines of Reflection are stupid or anything, I think that the lore they provide is excellent for world building, nor am I saying that they should be skippable per se. What I am saying is that not giving the player the option to work through them faster with candles as a means to access them is a frustrating experience that cripples a player's ability to experiment effectively and hugely discourages party variety by making it both bothersome and downright detrimental to use characters you haven't already unlocked abilities for. The progression in Darkest Dungeon 2 never feels like actual progress. It feels like you're slowly lifting restrictions that the game has arbitrarily imposed on you for no reason other than to have a progression system in the first place. And while this may not be too noticeable for a player that's completely new to the series, for returning fans like you and me, it really can feel like a slog. Which is a shame because the actual gameplay of Darkest Dungeon 2 is really fun and a marked step up from its predecessor, but that clearly came at the cost of the meta systems, which fell the other way. So yeah, you're not getting a Hamlet to rebuild, or a diverse roster to develop, or any of that micromanagement stuff that made the original game so addictive. That's just not what this game is. This experience is gameplay first, through combat, traversal, and relationships, and everything else comes second. If you're willing to give the game a chance based on those merits, with all the incredible visual and sound design that entails, taking you on a decrepit adventure of sacrifice and turmoil, then be my guest. It's a pretty easy recommendation to make, especially if you found the original Darkest Dungeon's combat loop too simplistic after a while, like I did. But if the metagame and roster building were where you really found the fun in Darkest Dungeon, then you should probably give this one a miss. As for me, personally, I think it's pretty good. I'm not great at it, and I'm still figuring things out, but it made enough of an impression on me to instigate this video, so make of that what you will. And hey, there's reason to be optimistic about the direction the game is going in regardless. There's a big free content update called Kingdoms, which promises an alternative way to play the game, and a paid DLC pack containing the Abomination coming out later this month. So if the game's current approach isn't quite what you're looking for, maybe Kingdoms will have you covered. I have no idea, of course, I'm just guessing, but it does look cool. And with such a strong foundation in combat and style already laid out for Red Hook to build upon, there are very few games that I'd like to see develop and thrive as a fully fitted experience akin to its predecessor, aside from Darkest Dungeon 2. Okay, full disclosure, this video started out as a side project while I worked on something a little bigger, which is why there's been a bit of a gap between uploads. My lack of experience kind of caught me out there, and it blew slightly out of proportion, but I have a feeling that when it is done, at some point, it'll be really cool and fun and interesting, which are not 3 words I'd use to describe my channel normally, but that's what we're going with. Anyway, I really hope this kind of guide/analysis video has been helpful, and thank you so much for checking it out. If you have anything you'd like to comment, I'd love to hear about it, but from me, that's all for now. This has been Rain Reaver. Thanks for watching.